The loudest voice doesn't always lead. It's the calm, focused presence in the room, the one who says little but moves with intent, that often ends up shaping what happens next. In a world where everyone feels pressured to explain themselves, announce their plans, and constantly prove their worth, there is something quietly powerful about the person who doesn't rush to speak. They observe, they think, they move when it matters. And strangely enough, those are often the people who build the strongest lives, the deepest influence, and the kind of confidence that doesn't depend on attention. In this video, we're going to explore the silent strategy that many people overlook. The quiet discipline that builds mental strength, sharpens focus, and allows you to move through life with calm control instead of constant reaction. This isn't about withdrawing from the world. It's about learning how to engage with it wisely. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by noise, comparison, or the pressure to constantly prove yourself, then this conversation may change how you approach your own growth. And if you're someone who values thoughtful conversations about Stoicism, psychology, and the pursuit of inner strength, consider subscribing to Psychresto Mind, not just to support the channel, but as a quiet commitment to your own development. Because every time you choose reflection over distraction and growth over noise, you take one more step toward becoming the strongest version of yourself. The loudest voice in the room rarely carries the deepest strength. At first glance, it may seem that the person who talks the most, explains the most, and constantly pushes their ideas into the spotlight holds the advantage. But if you watch carefully, you start to notice something different. The individuals who truly influence outcomes often move in a quieter way. They listen longer. They observe more carefully. They speak less frequently, yet when they finally do speak, people lean in. Their words carry weight because they are not scattered across every moment. They are chosen, intentional, measured. In a world that rewards noise and constant visibility, this quiet discipline almost feels strange, but the Stoics understood long ago that real strength often grows in silence. It is easy to believe that success requires constant explanation. Social media, competition, and modern culture quietly train us to believe that progress must always be visible. We show what we are building, we talk about our next move, we explain our ambitions to anyone who will listen, and in doing so, we start confusing communication with accomplishment. The more we talk about our plans, the more we feel as though we are already moving forward. Yet something subtle happens in this process. The energy that should have fueled action begins leaking into conversation. The motivation that once pushed us toward the work slowly dissolves into the comfort of being seen as someone who intends to work. Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself that waste no more time arguing what a good person should be one. That simple idea holds enormous power because it redirects attention away from appearance and toward action. The silent strategy begins with that shift. It is not about hiding your ambitions or withdrawing from the world. It is about understanding where your energy should go. When every thought is spoken immediately and every idea is shared before it matures, the mind becomes scattered. Silence, on the other hand, allows thoughts to sharpen. It creates space for reflection. Carl Jung once wrote that your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. That kind of clarity does not appear in constant conversation. It appears in stillness, in moments where the mind is allowed to settle long enough for deeper patterns to emerge. Think about how often the urge to speak comes not from wisdom but from discomfort. Silence can feel awkward. Many people rush to fill it with words simply to escape that feeling. Yet the ability to remain calm in quiet moments reveals something powerful about a person's internal state. A mind that is comfortable in silence is usually a mind that is not desperate for validation. It does not need constant reassurance from others. It does not need every idea to be approved before it moves forward. It simply observes, processes, and acts when the time is right. That sense of timing is central to the Stoic approach to life. The Stoics were not passive thinkers who withdrew from the world. They were practical observers of human behavior who understood that emotional reactions often create unnecessary chaos. Epictetus taught that people are not disturbed by events themselves, but by the meaning they assign to those events. When the mind is noisy and reactive, every comment feels like an attack, every delay feels like failure, and every disagreement feels personal. Silence interrupts that cycle. It allows emotion to settle before response emerges. Over time, this pause between stimulus and reaction becomes one of the most valuable skills a person can develop. Viktor Frankl described this space beautifully when he wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our power to choose. Silence expands that space. It slows down impulsive reactions and creates room for deliberate action. Instead of responding instantly to every opinion or provocation, the quiet mind evaluates what actually deserves attention. This discipline becomes especially important when we talk about ambition and success. Many people assume that the path forward requires constant movement and constant communication. They believe that if they are not announcing progress, they are falling behind. Yet history often shows the opposite pattern. The people who produce the most meaningful work frequently spend long periods out of sight, building quietly while others compete for attention. When the results finally appear, they seem sudden, but the truth is that the foundation was constructed slowly in silence. Aristotle captured this principle when he said that excellence is not an act but a habit. Habits form through repetition, and repetition rarely attracts applause. It happens early in the morning, late at night, and in moments where no one else is paying attention. Silence protects those habits. It shields them from premature judgment and unnecessary pressure. When a project or idea is shared too early, it often becomes entangled with expectations that distract from the work itself. There is also a psychological reason why quiet effort tends to produce stronger results. When a person speaks frequently about their goals, the brain can interpret that conversation as a form of accomplishment. The recognition from others provides a temporary reward that mimics the satisfaction of real progress. The mind receives praise before the effort has been completed. That early reward can reduce the urgency that originally drove the goal forward. In contrast, when a person works quietly, the only reward comes from actual progress. Each step forward strengthens discipline rather than replacing it. Carl Jung observed that people often project their potential outward instead of integrating it inward. In simple terms, this means we sometimes talk about the person we want to become instead of doing the difficult work required to become that person. Silence interrupts that pattern. It forces ambition to express itself through action rather than through description. The focus shifts from storytelling to building. As this pattern continues, something interesting begins to happen internally. Confidence grows, but it grows quietly. It does not depend on constant encouragement from others because it is built through repeated evidence of personal discipline. Each completed task becomes proof that effort leads somewhere. Each habit strengthens the belief that progress is possible. Over time, the need to explain oneself fades because the results gradually speak for themselves. This is why the silent strategy often appears mysterious to those who are unfamiliar with it. From the outside, it looks as though certain individuals simply possess calm confidence while others constantly struggle for recognition. In reality, that confidence is usually the result of long periods of focused effort that no one saw. The Stoics valued this kind of internal stability because they believed that true strength is measured not by how loudly a person expresses themselves, but by how well they govern their own mind. Seneca wrote that the greatest power a person can have is mastery over themselves. That mastery includes control over speech, emotion, and attention. When a person learns to direct their attention carefully, they stop wasting energy on arguments that lead nowhere. They become selective about what deserves their focus. Instead of reacting to every distraction, they concentrate on what truly moves their life forward. This selective attention becomes a powerful advantage in a noisy world. While others scatter their energy across endless conversations and comparisons, the quiet strategist moves steadily in one direction. Their progress may appear slow at first, but it is consistent, and consistency compounds. A small effort repeated every day eventually produces results that cannot be ignored. The deeper you explore this idea, the clearer it becomes that silence is not simply the absence of speech. It is a mental discipline. It is the ability to hold an idea long enough to examine it properly. It is the willingness to observe before reacting. It is the courage to continue building even when no one is watching. Over time, the silent strategy becomes less about avoiding noise and more about protecting clarity. The world will always be loud. Opinions will always compete for attention. But a person who learns to remain steady within that environment develops a rare advantage. Their thinking becomes clearer because it is not constantly interrupted. Their actions become more deliberate because they are not rushed by external pressure. This is the quiet transformation that Stoicism encourages. It does not promise an easy life or constant success. Instead, it offers something far more valuable: the ability to remain composed while the world around you becomes chaotic. When your mind is stable, your decisions improve. When your decisions improve, your actions become more effective. And when your actions are effective, success eventually follows without needing to be announced. The interesting thing about silence is that it doesn't only change how others perceive you, it slowly changes how you perceive the world. When the constant need to react begins to fade, your attention becomes sharper. You start noticing things that once slipped past you unnoticed. Conversations reveal more meaning. People reveal more intention. Situations reveal more patterns. The quiet mind begins to observe rather than simply react, and observation is one of the most underrated forms of intelligence. Most people move through life responding instantly to whatever happens around them. They hear something, feel something, and immediately speak or act. There is rarely a pause long enough to examine what is actually happening beneath the surface. That pause is where awareness grows. When the mind is not racing to fill every moment with speech or distraction, it begins collecting information more carefully. You start recognizing subtle behaviors in others. You notice tone, hesitation, patterns of thinking, and hidden motivations. The Stoics believed that understanding human nature was essential to living wisely, and that understanding rarely comes from constant talking. It comes from patient observation. Marcus Aurelius spent years reminding himself that people act according to what they believe is good for them, even when their actions appear irrational or harmful. That realization requires quiet reflection. Without it, every disagreement feels personal, and every misunderstanding feels like an insult. Silence gives you the distance needed to see people more clearly. Instead of immediately reacting to what someone says, you begin to notice why they might be saying it. Instead of responding emotionally to criticism, you examine whether it contains truth or simply reflects the other person's state of mind. This shift changes the way conflict unfolds. When a person learns to remain calm in conversation, they gain control of the emotional tone. Others may become louder or more defensive, but the quiet individual maintains balance. That composure often disarms tension before it grows. Carl Jung wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That insight becomes far easier to recognize when silence replaces reaction. When someone criticizes you, the instinctive response is often to defend yourself immediately. But if you pause, something interesting can happen. You begin to analyze the situation more objectively. Sometimes the criticism reveals a weakness worth improving. Other times, it reveals the insecurities of the person speaking. Either way, the pause creates space for understanding rather than conflict. Over time, this practice of observation strengthens emotional discipline. The mind becomes less reactive because it is no longer rushing to protect the ego. Instead of seeing every situation as a personal challenge, you begin to see it as information. Conversations become data, reactions become signals, the environment itself becomes something to study rather than something to fight. This mindset transforms the way decisions are made. Many of the greatest thinkers in Western philosophy valued this reflective state. Socrates famously practiced long periods of questioning and contemplation, believing that wisdom begins with recognizing how little we truly understand. That recognition requires humility, and humility grows best in silence. When a person speaks constantly, they reinforce the illusion that they already know enough. When a person listens carefully, they begin to realize how much more there is to learn. Modern psychology also supports this idea. Studies on attention and cognition suggest that the brain processes information more deeply when it is not overwhelmed by constant input. Silence allows thoughts to connect with each other more effectively. Ideas that seemed unrelated suddenly reveal patterns. Problems that once felt overwhelming begin to break into manageable parts. The mind becomes more creative because it is not constantly reacting to external noise. This is why many of history's most creative breakthroughs occurred during moments of quiet reflection rather than during intense conversation. The mind requires stillness to integrate information. When that stillness is interrupted repeatedly, insight becomes difficult to reach. The silent strategist understands this instinctively. Instead of filling every moment with activity, they deliberately create time to think. The deeper benefit of this practice appears gradually. As the mind becomes more comfortable in silence, it begins confronting thoughts that were previously ignored. Distractions often serve as a way to avoid uncomfortable truths about ourselves. When those distractions disappear, the mind becomes a mirror. It reflects fears, insecurities, ambitions, and unresolved questions. Many people find this uncomfortable, which is why they rarely allow themselves to sit quietly with their own thoughts. Carl Jung believed that confronting the unconscious mind was one of the most important steps in psychological growth. He warned that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Silence opens the door to that process. Without constant stimulation, deeper thoughts begin to surface. At first, they may appear as vague feelings or subtle realizations. Over time, they become clearer. You may notice patterns in your behavior that were previously invisible. Perhaps certain fears repeatedly influence your decisions. Perhaps certain ambitions have been quietly guiding your actions for years. When these patterns become visible, something important happens. You gain the ability to choose whether they continue controlling your life. This level of awareness changes how goals are approached. Instead of chasing what others expect, you begin identifying what genuinely matters to you. The difference can be profound. Many people pursue careers, achievements, or lifestyles that impress others but leave them internally dissatisfied. Silence helps reveal whether your path aligns with your values or merely reflects external pressure. The Stoics emphasized this alignment between action and inner values. They believed that peace of mind comes from living according to reason and virtue rather than according to external approval. When a person acts only to impress others, their happiness becomes fragile because it depends on constant validation. When a person acts according to their own principles, their confidence becomes stable because it is internally generated. This internal stability becomes especially valuable during difficult moments. Life inevitably introduces challenges that disrupt plans and expectations. When those moments arrive, People who depend on external approval often feel lost because their sense of identity collapses with the situation. The person who has cultivated inner clarity responds differently. They may still feel disappointment or frustration, but their sense of direction remains intact. Silence also strengthens patience, which is another rare skill in a fast-moving world. Most people want immediate results. They expect progress to appear quickly, and when it does not, they assume something is wrong. The quiet strategist understands that meaningful progress often unfolds slowly. They recognize that growth is rarely dramatic in the beginning. It is usually subtle, almost invisible, until enough small steps accumulate to create visible change. Aristotle described this process when he explained that virtue develops through repeated action. A single decision rarely defines a person's character. Instead, character emerges from the habits we practice every day. Silence helps protect those habits because it reduces the distractions that often interrupt them. When the mind is not constantly chasing external stimulation, it becomes easier to maintain consistent effort. Another benefit of quiet discipline appears in the way it influences relationships. When someone speaks less and listens more, others feel heard. This simple change can transform interactions. Instead of conversations becoming competitions for attention, they become opportunities for understanding. People often reveal more about themselves when they feel that someone is genuinely listening. This does not mean silence should be used as a manipulation tactic. Its power lies in authenticity. When someone truly listens without immediately preparing a response, the conversation becomes more meaningful. The other person senses that their words are being considered rather than dismissed. Over time, this builds trust. Trust is one of the most powerful forms of influence because it cannot be forced. It grows gradually through consistent behavior. A person who speaks thoughtfully rather than impulsively begins to earn a reputation for reliability. Others learn that when this person finally shares an opinion, it has likely been carefully considered. Seneca once observed that the wise person speaks only when it improves upon silence. That idea captures the essence of strategic communication. Words become valuable when they are used deliberately. When every thought is spoken immediately, speech loses its impact. When speech is selective, it carries weight. The more this practice develops, the more noticeable the difference becomes. While others react quickly to every situation, the quiet strategist moves more deliberately. They pause before responding. They analyze before deciding. This slower approach may appear cautious at first, but it often produces better results because it reduces impulsive mistakes. This does not mean the silent strategist avoids action. On the contrary, silence often makes action more decisive. When the moment to act finally arrives, the mind is clear because it has already examined the situation carefully. There is less hesitation because the thinking has already been done. Carl Jung once said that thinking is difficult, which is why most people judge. Silence encourages thinking rather than judging. Instead of immediately labeling situations as good or bad, the mind examines them more deeply. This examination reveals possibilities that impulsive reactions would miss. As this habit strengthens, the individual begins to develop something that can only be described as presence. It is the calm confidence that emerges when a person is comfortable with themselves. They no longer feel pressure to prove their intelligence or their worth through constant explanation. Their actions and decisions gradually create a quiet authority. People often sense this authority even before a word is spoken. It appears in body language, tone, and emotional stability. The quiet individual seems grounded, not easily shaken by sudden changes or intense emotions. This composure becomes a form of influence because others instinctively look for stability during uncertain moments. The Stoics valued this kind of presence because they believed leadership begins with self-governance. A person who cannot manage their own emotions will struggle to guide others effectively. Silence strengthens this internal control. By observing thoughts and reactions rather than immediately expressing them, the mind becomes more disciplined. This discipline eventually transforms silence from a simple habit into a powerful strategy for navigating life. The individual who masters it becomes less distracted, more perceptive, and more intentional in their actions. Their energy is no longer scattered across countless conversations and reactions. It is concentrated. Momentum, once it begins to build, has a quiet but undeniable force behind it. At first, it feels subtle, almost invisible, like a small shift in the way you think and move through your day. The difference may not even be noticeable to others yet, but internally something has changed. Your attention becomes more deliberate. Your actions begin to align more closely with your intentions, and slowly the scattered energy that once disappeared into endless conversations, reactions, and distractions starts gathering in one direction. This is where the silent strategy begins transforming from an idea into a lived experience. It is no longer just about speaking less. It becomes about directing your mind with discipline. The Stoics believed that the mind is both our greatest ally and our greatest obstacle, depending on whether we govern it or allow it to govern us. Marcus Aurelius often wrote to himself about this internal responsibility, reminding himself that his thoughts shape his reality. He understood that if a person cannot guide their own thinking, then the outside world will happily do it for them. In modern life, the outside world is constantly offering suggestions about how you should feel, what you should desire, and how quickly you should achieve it. Every day there are countless signals competing for your attention. News, opinions, comparisons, expectations, and endless streams of information flow toward you without pause. If the mind reacts to every one of those signals, it becomes exhausted. It loses the ability to focus deeply on anything meaningful. Silence interrupts that cycle. When you begin practicing quiet discipline, something interesting happens to your relationship with attention. Instead of being pulled in every direction by external noise, you start deciding where your attention goes. That may sound simple, but it is one of the most powerful forms of control a person can develop. Attention determines what you learn, what you notice, and what eventually becomes important in your life. When attention is scattered, progress becomes difficult. When attention is focused, growth accelerates. Carl Jung believed that the mind contains enormous potential that often remains hidden because people rarely examine their inner world carefully. He suggested that much of human behavior is guided by unconscious patterns that people fail to recognize. Silence makes those patterns easier to notice. When you slow down long enough to observe your own thinking, you start seeing habits that once operated automatically. Perhaps you notice that certain situations trigger the same emotional reactions every time. Perhaps you notice that certain doubts appear whenever you attempt something new. These patterns can quietly shape decisions for years without ever being questioned. But once they become visible, they begin losing their power. Awareness introduces choice. This is why Stoic philosophy placed so much importance on self-examination. The Stoics believed that a person who understands their own mind becomes far more capable of navigating the world wisely. Without self-awareness, people often chase goals that do not truly belong to them. They follow expectations that were never carefully evaluated. Silence gives you the opportunity to examine whether your direction actually reflects your values. That examination can feel uncomfortable at first. When the mind stops running from distraction to distraction, deeper questions appear. You begin asking yourself whether the things you pursue genuinely matter to you, or whether they simply feel important because others expect them to be. Many people discover that they have been living according to habits that were never consciously chosen, but this realization is not a problem. In fact, it is the beginning of freedom. When you become aware of the forces shaping your life, you gain the ability to change them. Instead of drifting through patterns created by circumstance, you begin shaping your own path intentionally. This shift is subtle but powerful. It transforms life from a series of reactions into a series of decisions. The silent strategist understands that meaningful decisions require reflection. They are not rushed simply to keep up with the pace of others. Patience becomes part of the process. In a culture that often celebrates speed, patience can feel almost rebellious. Yet many of the most important achievements in human history were the result of patient thinking rather than impulsive action. Aristotle spoke about the idea of practical wisdom, which he described as the ability to make good decisions in complex situations. Practical wisdom does not emerge from quick reactions. It emerges from careful observation and thoughtful judgment. Silence creates the environment where this kind of thinking can develop. The mind that is comfortable with stillness becomes better at identifying what truly matters. Instead of responding to every opportunity, it begins selecting opportunities carefully. Instead of saying yes to every request, it begins protecting its time and energy. This selective approach does not make a person less productive. It makes them more effective. Many people struggle because they attempt to do too many things at once. They spread their attention across countless tasks and ambitions, hoping that effort alone will produce results. But effort without direction often leads to exhaustion rather than progress. The silent strategist focuses on fewer things with greater intensity. That focus changes the quality of work. When attention is concentrated, the mind begins noticing details that others miss. Problems reveal solutions that were not obvious before. Creativity increases because the mind has enough space to explore ideas fully rather than abandoning them halfway through. Silence allows thought to deepen. This depth becomes one of the greatest advantages a person can develop. In a world filled with rapid opinions and shallow analysis, the ability to think carefully stands out. People who reflect before speaking often produce insights that others overlook. Their ideas carry more weight because they have been shaped through careful consideration. Seneca once observed that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Much of this suffering comes from uncontrolled thinking. When the mind races without direction, it easily creates worries about situations that may never occur. Silence helps interrupt this pattern. When you observe your thoughts rather than immediately believing them, you begin recognizing how often the mind exaggerates problems. This recognition does not eliminate challenges, but it changes how you respond to them. Instead of becoming overwhelmed by every difficulty, you begin evaluating problems more rationally. You ask yourself what can actually be controlled and what must simply be accepted. This distinction lies at the heart of Stoic philosophy. Epictetus famously taught that some things are within our control and others are not. Peace of mind emerges when we focus our effort on the things we can influence and release the rest. Silence strengthens this ability because it reduces the emotional noise that often clouds judgment. When the mind is calm, it becomes easier to separate genuine problems from imagined ones. As this clarity develops, confidence begins to grow in a different way. It is no longer the fragile confidence that depends on external praise. Instead, it becomes a quiet certainty built from repeated experience. Each time you face a situation calmly rather than reacting impulsively, you reinforce the belief that you can handle difficulty. Over time, this quiet confidence changes how others perceive you. People often gravitate toward individuals who remain steady when circumstances become stressful. Stability becomes a form of influence because it creates a sense of trust. Others feel that they can rely on someone who does not panic under pressure. This influence rarely appears dramatic. It develops gradually through consistent behavior. The person who remains calm in difficult conversations, who listens before speaking, and who responds thoughtfully rather than emotionally begins to stand out. Not because they seek attention, but because their presence introduces balance into chaotic situations. Carl Jung suggested that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of their parents. What he meant is that many people unconsciously repeat patterns that they have never examined. Silence provides the opportunity to break those patterns. When you examine your own beliefs and reactions, you begin distinguishing between habits you inherited and choices you genuinely want to make. This process requires courage. Self-reflection often reveals uncomfortable truths. You may discover fears that have quietly shaped your decisions. You may notice ways in which ego has influenced your behavior. But this awareness does not weaken you. It strengthens you because it replaces unconscious patterns with conscious choices. The Stoics believed that the ultimate goal of philosophy was not intellectual debate, but personal transformation. They practiced reflection daily because they understood that growth requires continuous examination of one's own actions and thoughts. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations not for an audience but for himself. They were reminders to stay disciplined, rational, and aligned with his values. This practice of reflection can be incredibly powerful when adopted in modern life. Taking time each day to review your thoughts and actions helps reinforce awareness. You begin noticing where your attention was wasted and where it was used wisely. Gradually, this awareness improves future decisions. Silence becomes the environment where this reflection can occur. Without it, the mind remains too busy to examine itself. When the noise quiets, insights begin appearing naturally. You start understanding why certain habits help you grow while others hold you back. The more clearly you understand your own mind, the more effectively you can guide it. Instead of feeling controlled by emotions or impulses, you begin directing them toward productive action. Discipline stops feeling like a constant struggle because your actions begin aligning with your deeper values. This alignment produces a sense of internal stability that is difficult to disturb. Life will always present unexpected challenges, but a disciplined mind responds differently to those challenges. Instead of collapsing under pressure, it adapts. And adaptation, when combined with patience and clarity, creates a powerful form of resilience. And when you really understand all of this, you begin to see that the silent strategy was never about hiding your voice. It was about discovering where your real power lives. Not in constant explanation, not in proving yourself to people who are too distracted to notice the work anyway, but in the quiet discipline of mastering your own mind, choosing your actions carefully, and allowing your life to speak through the results you build day after day. The Stoics believed that the strongest person is not the one who controls others, but the one who governs themselves. When your thoughts become steady, when your attention becomes intentional, and when your actions begin aligning with your values, something remarkable happens. The noise of the world loses its grip on you. You stop chasing validation and start building meaning, and that quiet transformation changes everything. So move with clarity, build with patience, speak when your words add value, and let your actions carry the weight of your character. Because in a world obsessed with being heard, the person who masters silence often becomes the one who shapes the future. If this message resonated with you, there's another video on the screen right now that continues this journey into Stoic wisdom and mental strength. Take a moment and watch it next. And thank you for being part of Psychresto Mind, a community of people choosing discipline, clarity, and inner strength in a noisy world.